We do not deny the existence of any historical figures, historical events, countries, peoples, and so on. The only thing we're trying to say is that it's necessary to introduce substantial corrections to issues related to chronology. That is, when something happened, and where certain events took place.
Today we'll continue moving along the chronology, but we'll try to talk more about names. In other words, about who Genghis Khan, Dmitri Donskoy, and Ivan Kalida were. Whether these people existed or didn't, what they did, what their real names were. We'll focus more on that. But let's start with our interactive question, because this question seems extremely interesting and, I'd even say, bold from your side.
I'd like to briefly explain why we felt the urge to ask this particular question. We received a flood of responses, all kinds of different versions, and at some point, it simply became interesting to pose this question. Dear viewers, what do you think? Do I, Andrei Podoynitsyn, work on the new chronology because I'm genuinely interested in it, or because I'm being paid a lot, or because I have nothing better to do?
I think you know the phone numbers. I must say, we're extremely interested in your point of view on this. Because there have been so many different responses from different quarters. People say all sorts of things about Andrei and about me. So, call in. It's interesting and very important for us to know what you think. We already have a call.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I find everything you talk about very interesting, but I have this question. Several years ago, I watched a documentary about Peter the Great and his reforms. They showed some documents signed by Peter, dated summer of the year 7832 from the creation of the world. What do you think about this date? Where does it come from?
You'll answer that in a moment. I love this. So far only 3 people have called. 2 think you're being paid a lot. 1 thinks you have nothing to do. And not a single person thinks you're doing this because you're interested.
From your mouth to God's ears, dear viewers.
Let's see what happens next. So, why was there such a strange date?
There is nothing strange about that date. In fact, if my memory serves me right, it was under Peter the Great that the transition was made to the dating system we use today. That is, from the Nativity of Christ. Roughly speaking, the switch to a new era, the era that was already in use in Europe, as it is commonly believed. Before Peter the Great, Russia used a dating system counted from the creation of the world. The difference between the 2 dates, I'm afraid to give an exact number, is about 5,508 years or somewhere around that.
So, for now most people think you're interested in the topic, but people have only just started calling, so it's still too early to draw conclusions. Now, we began talking about Genghis Khan. You said his name was different, but what did this person do? What is his place in history, according to your version?
Andrei, you know what's interesting? In the end, we're saying essentially the same thing as the traditional version. We believe that indeed, in the 14th century, Genghis Khan, also known as Grand Prince Georgy Danilovich, created the greatest empire in the world. We're only adjusting the initial parameters of this Genghis Khan. We believe that he did not rely on wild nomadic tribes, as history textbooks describe, nor on barren steppes where no traces of mines, weapons workshops, or anything else have been found. Instead, he relied on a country that by all parameters was, and to this day remains, potentially, the richest and most densely populated land. And this country was inhabited by a very talented, hardworking, and, it must be said, war-capable people.
Russian history also has a figure named Ivan Kalida known as the Gatherer of Russia. I'm speaking now about traditional history. If by the time of Ivan Kalida, as you claim, Russia was already a vast empire, then the question arises. Did Ivan Kalida exist, and if he did, what was his role?
Ivan Kalida did exist. Moreover, according to our reconstruction, he was the biological brother of Grand Prince Georgy Danilovich, who led the state after the rather early death of the first and continued his conquests.
Led the state? You need to explain which one, what you mean.
The same one, the Great Mongol Empire, whose center was located somewhat farther west than is commonly believed. Not in the Mongolian steppes, and not even in the vaguely placed Sarai that some try to situate now in Central Asia, or closer to the Volga, but directly in the Vladimir Suzdal Russia. That region was actually called Lord Novgorod the Great. It wasn't a single city, but an entire region. Strictly speaking, it makes more sense when a major conquest or a large expedition has not a single city as its center, because any city, even the largest, has very limited resources. Its center is an entire region with a large population, developed infrastructure, agriculture, industry, trade, a market, and so on, in other words, a functioning state. The center of this region was Vladimir Suzdal, Russia.
Sorry, I just got very curious. After all, most people think that you are interested. And after your remark, from your mouth to God's ears, fewer people now think that you're underpaid. So, what then was Ivan Kalida's achievement if he inherited an already unified state?
A state that was in the process of unification, in a phase of very active consolidation. Ivan Danilovich Kalida. He is also Batu Khan. We've already said that this is one of his names. Perhaps it comes from the word Batya, father, the well-known Cossack form of address to the elder of the clan.
That is, not the Mongol name Batu, as is commonly believed, but something derived from Batya.
Well, fine, let's assume that the word Batu somehow correlates with the Mongols. He continued the conquest begun by Georgy Danilovich. It was apparently during his time that Western Europe fell into vassal dependence on the empire. Moreover, I'm forced yet again to say something that's not very familiar even to our ears. I mean the members of the new Chronology group. Apparently, Ivan Danilovich Kalida founded the papacy in Rome. I understand your reaction.
No, I just want to clarify. So, Ivan Danilovich Kalida was a Christian?
Of course.
A Christian. Then why did he found the papacy?
We should say that, apparently, he somehow wanted.
I mean, was he an Orthodox Christian?
He was simply a Christian. At that time, distinctions like Orthodox, Catholic, or Muslim apparently didn't yet exist. He was simply a Christian. Just like the entire population of the empire.
When he created the papacy, he created it as the center of what?
Most likely, as a center of religious authority in the newly conquered territories.
Simply Christianity, not Catholic or anything like that.
Absolutely right. Just Christianity. By the way, remembering the promise to answer the question, we received a wonderful letter from one of our viewers, where a question was raised. He happens to be one of our opponents, but he quite fairly asked a question about the Vatican, that the history of the popes is recorded in great detail, that it can be traced far back, and that it is very difficult to falsify because it's hard to make everything fit together afterward, and so on. I'd like to make a small digression and return to a topic we discussed in one of the previous broadcasts, namely primary sources. Back then we didn't touch on the topic of libraries. The genealogy of libraries, so to speak. So, the Vatican Library is the most illustrative example here, because it is considered to be the one that never burned, was never destroyed, never perished, and was never flooded. In other words, it survived in the best possible condition. It's very interesting to look at when this library actually existed as such. When we turn to the official history of the Vatican Library, we find something quite curious. First of all, it was founded, in a sense, 3 times. The first time by Pope Sixtus IV, if my memory serves, in the mid-15th century. But apparently this pope only voiced the idea of creating it, because it had to be created again 30 years later by Pope Nicholas I, I believe. But even this founding was somehow incomplete, because the third founding happened, according to the official history, 100 years later, in 1585.
So, what was happening to the books? Nothing can be founded multiple times. Anything can be founded only once, and then destroyed and founded again. So, a question arises. What happened to the books that were in this library between these foundings?
Another question arises as well. Which books, exactly? Aside from the fact that the third founding took place in 1585, right after the Council of Trent, the building of the library itself was constructed between 1585 and 1590. Therefore, we take the liberty of assuming that in reality there was only one founding, the last, the third one. And regarding the books, If we look at the history of when the first major acquisitions occurred, we find that the first large batch of manuscripts and volumes arrived in 1628, and there were two more large acquisitions that formed the main collection of the library, in the middle and at the end of the 17th century. I unfortunately don't recall the exact dates.
You said that this library was founded 3 times. We've figured out the 3rd time, but was there anything in it when it was founded the 1st and 2nd times, and where did that go?
We would like to ask what exactly was in it after the first 2 foundings. Unfortunately, we have not come across a clear answer. If anyone has information about this, it would be very interesting to know. According to the official historian of the Vatican Library, the only reliably attested fact is that the first large batch of acquisitions, thousands of manuscripts and volumes, appeared in the 17th century.
How do official historians explain the fact that the library was founded 3 times, and that these books must somehow have disappeared? Is there any explanation?
Probably it is explained somehow, but unconvincingly. In other words, it's impossible to pin down concrete facts in order to ask a specific question. What exactly was going on there? Among medieval artists up until the 17th century, there existed a custom of depicting biblical scenes against purely medieval backdrops. That is, against medieval cities, medieval everyday life, medieval clothing, medieval utensils, and so on. Pure medieval imagery. There was no trace of antiquity yet.
How is this explained? It's an obvious fact. There must be some explanation.
An absolutely clear fact. And it is explained, at first glance, by the simplest things, psychological reasons, I'd say. It is formulated in various ways. That was the tradition. That's one explanation. Or a more elaborate one. That for medieval people at the time, it was easier to perceive biblical scenes against landscapes familiar to them. But I must point out.
Excuse me. So, from the start, it is asserted that the artists were not telling the truth. For the sake of tradition, for the sake of easier perception, they were not telling the truth.
A very strange idea is asserted. It is claimed that artists painted the Middle Ages in their pure form. For example, anyone can open an art album and see what I mean. Take the Judgment of Paris, for instance. Paris in plate armor, an actual knight in medieval armor. Helmet, cuirass, spear, metal gauntlets. Everything as it should be. It turns out that the artists painted the Middle Ages. The viewers saw the Middle Ages. The Church, which at the time served as the strictest censor, also saw the Middle Ages. Yet everyone supposedly understood that this was antiquity. Everyone looked, saw a forest, but knew that it was a desert.
That's strange.
I don't know, maybe I'm missing something big, but it's hard to reconcile these things.
I think we'll continue this interactive question for now.
Andrei, I'm only asking for one thing. There are arguments and theories that explain all of this much more simply, and the simple explanation is that, from the point of view of medieval artists who lived before the 17th century, biblical events were literally medieval events. That's all.
Let's hold off ending this interactive question. For now, it's clear that most people believe you're doing this because you're interested. But 2 viewpoints are fighting for the silver medal, that you're paid a lot, and that you have nothing to do. I'm curious which one will win silver. It seems the gold is already decided. We have a call. Please, go ahead.
Hello, I'd like to thank you for the very interesting shows and the very interesting topic. I have a question. If, according to your books, the New Testament describes events that took place in the 11th century, and Jesus Christ was born in the 11th century, then how does that affect our current calendar? What year are we living in now? And is the year 2000 problem somehow related to this?
I see. Thank you. A good question.
Thank you very much, Marina. As for the year 2000 problem, I'm not quite sure what it means. It probably means whether we should celebrate it or not.
No, what year are we living in now? And, accordingly, does the year 2000 actually arrive in half a year?
One can say quite clearly that, if we were to be completely precise from a scientific point of view and truly start our calendar from the Nativity of Christ, then the coming year would be anything you like, just not the year 2000. But that should never stop us from joyfully and wholeheartedly celebrating it all together.
Understanding that we're celebrating something that isn't real.
That's not important. New Year's is simply a wonderful tradition in life. All the more so with the year 2000. Everyone is preparing for it. God forbid we spoil the holiday in any way. But if we speak seriously about our chronological issues, many viewers among our opponents rightly pointed out that the date 1053 or 1054, which we refer to, is derived from written sources. But I'd like to emphasize again, at the site of the supernova explosion, there is the Crab Nebula. Regressive counting of the nebula's expansion still gives the 11th century, whichever way you look at it. Yes, indeed, with accuracy to the year.
Say that again about the Crab Nebula. Aggressive counting of the Crab Nebula. What does that mean?
A star exploded. In its place, the Crab Nebula formed, which naturally and according to basic physical laws, is constantly expanding. Knowing its rate of expansion, you can simply run the calculation backward and determine the moment when it contracts into a point. An elementary thing. No matter what, you get the 11th century. Of course, you don't get the exact year. It's impossible to calculate with year-level precision. I can't vouch for the exactness. We do, to some extent, rely on written sources. But I'd like to stress that we do not reject all written sources. In fact, we don't reject them at all. We say that they are a code that needs to be deciphered. That's all.
Let's sum up your question, and then I'll ask mine. For now, it seems that most people think you're doing this because you're interested.
Thank you very much.
Some people think you have nothing better to do. It seems to me that, in fact, the first and last answers are very similar.
The last answer is apparently based on the consequences of the events of August 17th of last year. Many people really were on vacation.
And a minority think you're paid a lot. Actually, it seems to me that that's about right. The most important thing is to do this because you find it interesting. At least, that's how it looks to me.
Without a doubt.
Now I want to ask you my own question. I want to remind you that some time ago I asked whether conversations about politics interest you or not. Back then, you said political discussions don't interest you. As you can see, we don't have many politicians here. And when they do come, we don't really talk about politics. So, the question I'm about to ask you will also affect what the upcoming broadcasts will be like. So, I'm curious to know, on Night Flight, are you most interested in conversations about the past, historical topics, about the present, meaning what our lives are like now and our current problems, or about the future, like forecasts, astrologers, and so on? Depending on how you answer, that's how we'll shape our future broadcasts. And I'll keep asking. You said that Ivan Kalida founded the papacy in Rome. Back then, there was no division of religions. At what point did it happen?
Apparently, the process of religious division began in the 15th century.
In what way?
We need to make a small historical digression here.
Sorry, I asked you incorrectly, interrupting myself. Before the 15th century, was there a single common religion?
Yes, before that there was one religion. True, within that common religion various movements and deviations had already begun to appear. In other words, the religious split didn't arise out of nowhere. But organizationally and spiritually, it was still essentially one religion. Apparently, the split occurred in the 15th century, as a result in particular, of the following events. Roughly 100 years after the creation of the great empire, this enormous state faced problems never seen before, namely, epidemics. Earlier, an epidemic that arose, say, in Italy or on the Black Sea, where there are natural sources of plague, for example, was usually strictly localized. It did not spread further. But with the rise of the empire, a new phenomenon appeared: perfectly organized communication routes, post riders, post stations, couriers, trade, military expeditions. Because of this, all these diseases gained the ability to spread over vast territories at great speed. Apparently, in the first half of the 15th century, a monstrous epidemic broke out. By the way, it is well known from traditional history. It simply shifted into the 14th century. It was a horrific epidemic that wiped out a third of the population in some areas, half in others, and some cities died out completely. And then the supreme rulers of the empire made a twofold decision. First, to establish administrative divisions within the empire. And it seems that this is when Turkey was separated out on the territory of the former Roman Empire with its center in Constantinople. And second, however bitter it is to admit, apparently campaigns were organized whose purpose was the physical extermination of the population of the conquered lands.
How does all this connect to my question?
Let me explain. As a result of the administrative division, whose purpose was to establish quarantine in separate regions, political separation of various territories began. Administrations became distinct. Borders appeared, even if they were only quarantine boundaries. As a result, there arose a need to confirm this political separation and somehow justify it in a new way. And so came the intention to divide the religions.
Am I right in understanding that what you're saying is an astonishing historical metaphor? That the religions split because a massive epidemic struck the world?
No, it's not such a direct connection.
But that's exactly what you've just described.
Not quite. The epidemic made new administrative borders necessary.
And those, in turn, made new religions necessary.
In principle, yes, you could put it that way. On the other hand, borders could arise for many other reasons, primarily political ones. When rulers of large territories, for entirely objective reasons and their own ambitions, wanted more power for themselves and less for the center, as people say today, meaning the metropolis.
In your opinion, if there had been no such enormous epidemic, would the religious split have occurred?
I think, Andrei, that the religious split was still secondary. What came first was political division. As for that epidemic, it should be said that even within traditional history, there are extensive studies on what would have happened if that monstrous epidemic and the pandemics of the 14th century, though we claim the 15th, had never occurred.
I apologize. I just want to address our viewers. So far, most people prefer to talk either about the past or about the future. Maybe that's because we're having a historical broadcast right now and no one wants to talk about the present. For me, as someone who's going to be making these shows, that's a surprising answer, because most of the time we talk about the present. Whatever you say now is what you'll see in the coming weeks. That is, we might simply turn into a kind of historical talk show. We have a call, please go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to ask a question about the origin of the word Russian. In Russian, it's an adjective. Unlike in other languages, for example, Tatar, Lithuanian, those are nouns. Have you studied the origin of this word, and doesn't this support the idea that other peoples belong to Russian territory? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I must say, the question is very valid. And that observation has indeed been made. Another matter is that we haven't carried out any focused research on nationalities specifically in that direction. But the observation is absolutely correct. Let me reply with an example. In 1939, a census was carried out in the Soviet Union, already after collectivization, industrialization, all sorts of purges, and so on. Stalin decided to count how many of us remained after the first stage. During that census, for the first time, a nationality field was introduced, which didn't exist before. As is known, in the Russian Empire there was a different classification, by religious confessions. Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, and so on. So, when the results of this census came in, astonishing things emerged. How people in various regions actually called themselves. Among others, names such as the Drevlians and the Goryans were mentioned.
In 1939?
In 1939, Andrei. It's really very interesting. Moreover, according to stories passed down from their great-grandparents, people remembered that earlier, at some point, a different language had been spoken in their region, one that differed from Russian. Therefore, most likely, the concept Russian is a collective term for a very large number of different peoples or nationalities that lived in that territory. Most likely, and this was accurately noted, it is a collective name for the population living across that vast territory. I recall that in one of our broadcasts we mentioned that it's possible that even the word Russia came from the notion of scattering, which has a similar root. That is, a people or population that was scattered across a huge territory.
We didn't talk about that.
We didn't? There is such a theory.
There's another figure in Russian history, Dmitri Donskoy. As Tina recalled, when she read history textbooks as a child, as we all did, he defeated the Kulikovo field battle, thereby beginning the liberation from the Tatar-Mongol yoke. If the Tatar-Mongol yoke didn't exist, then the question arises, was Dmitri Donskoy real, from your point of view? And if he was, what did he actually do? What is he famous for?
Here our views practically coincide with the traditional version, you could even say entirely. Not only did Dmitri Donskoy exist, he really did defeat the Temnik Mamai at the Battle of Kulikovo.
Whom?
So, as was mentioned in the previous broadcast, Ivan Vasilievich Velyaminov. After the death of his father, Dmitri Donskoy became Grand Prince at a very young age. A Temnik was a military commander, essentially the Minister of Defense, the number 2 person in the state. His authority was practically equal to that of the Grand Prince. Apparently, this tradition went back to the 2 brothers, Georgy Danilovich and Ivan Danilovich. So, during the minority of Dmitri Donskoy, the Temniks, and this was also a hereditary position, essentially seized the leading role in the state. When the young and very warlike Prince Dmitri Donskoy came of age and gained some strength, he decided to change this situation in his favor.
So, is this what in our traditional history textbooks was called a civil war?
It was a classic internal feud. Russian troops gathered on both sides. We've already mentioned that this is exactly how it is depicted on icons. A colossal and bloody battle took place, in which Dmitri Donskoy prevailed. The result of this victory was the appearance of the Golden Rule. This was a law on succession, according to which the order of succession in the Russian state or the empire was changed. Previously, the throne typically passed from brother to brother, but after this, it began to pass from father to son.
Dmitri Donskoy introduced this?
Yes. Moreover, we believe that in the Western European tradition this law was reflected as the Golden Bull of King Charles IV. Although the expression, Charles IV, simply means, the 4th king in the sequence.
And who was he? What was his real name?
Dmitri Donskoy.
So, Dmitri Donskoy and Charles IV are the same person?
Let's say that one of the prototypes of the figure described under the name Charles IV was Dmitri Donskoy.
We have a call, please.
Good evening. You just said that before the 15th century, Christian religions were not divided, right? And to what time do you assign the period that we in traditional history call the Holy Inquisition? Because, as far as we understand, that was not later than that.
It gives the impression that the Inquisition was most likely a single institution, essentially the only Inquisition of the 16th century. And overall, it functioned as a reaction. The thing is, our view of the Inquisition also differs a bit from the traditional one, and here's how. The traditional view of the Inquisition is generally very negative: medieval obscurantism, suppression of free thought, burning heretics and witches at the stake. For the most part, completely innocent people. But it seems to us that if you look closely at the Bible itself, for example, and at various other texts, you'll find that the Inquisition primarily persecuted, first, sexual perversions, and second, various occult practices, calling up spirits, summoning the dead, witchcraft, love spells, and so on. Apparently, the Inquisition was a reaction to excessively free and debauched morals, which, by the way, led to.
So, you justify the Inquisition?
I'm not justifying the Inquisition. In this case I'm simply reporting a diagnosis, so to speak. This isn't about emotional judgments, it's a statement of facts. So, these loose morals, which apparently were widespread, contributed among other things to the broad spread of diseases that later became known as venereal diseases. And it seems a great many people practiced all sorts of occult things. And even today, we still can't really say what that actually is or what consequences it leads to. Let's leave that outside the scope of this discussion. In short, it seems the Inquisition was a reaction against straying from the canons of early Christianity in an attempt to restore those canons.
When did it exist?
The 16th century.
Every broadcast you say something unbelievable. Now you've said that Dmitri Donskoy and Charles IV are the same, and that Charles IV is just the fourth king. I have a question. Why was the Russian prince Dmitri Donskoy called a king?
First of all, Andrei, I didn't say they were the same person.
Well, that they have a lot in common.
The fact is, if you look even at surviving primary sources, you'll find that in official diplomatic correspondence our rulers were called not only kings but great emperors. At one time I read with great pleasure a wonderful book written by former Soviet ambassador to England, Viktor Popov. It was published in 1990, if memory serves, and has absolutely nothing to do with chronology. A professional diplomat who was lucky enough to access the royal archives shared his impressions. The book is about the royal family, brilliantly written, with constant precise references to primary sources. Excellent work. He wrote about the correspondence between Elizabeth I and Ivan the Terrible. In particular, he notes how our ruler was addressed: Dear Brother, Great Prince, Great Tsar, Great Emperor. These titles appeared literally one after another, separated only by commas.
It seemed to me that we always had tsars, while in the West they had kings. So, when a Russian prince is called a king, that raises a question for me. Being called an emperor doesn't raise any questions, because our tsar was also called an emperor.
Andrei, abroad, particularly in Germany, our prince would be called a first.
So, Karl IV, or the fourth king, is a Western name for a Russian tsar.
Exactly. It's the same analogy as one example our opponent on the internet gave. Supposedly, after World War II, one of the countless maps published in England had the entire territory of our huge country labeled Soviet Russia. Not the USSR, but Soviet Russia. We're not going to deny the existence of such a large state because of that. On the contrary, that's exactly what we're saying. When we look at a medieval map from the mid-18th century and see Russian Empire written in one typeface, and then, in a typeface 3 times larger, Great Tartary, these are two names for the same state, our state. Great Tartary was simply the Western external name of our country.
I see. We have a caller, please.
Good evening, Andrei. I'd like to ask a question. I feel a bit uncomfortable, but what money does your foundation operate on? Who finances it? Maybe it's not a shameful question, I don't know, but I feel awkward.
Actually, there's nothing shameful about it, especially since there is no foundation. To clarify, I'd like to explain what the new Chronology group is. It's not any kind of formalized organization of like-minded people. Each of us lives at home and works at our own job. Academician Fomenko works at Moscow State University, at the Mechanics and Mathematics department. Gleb Nosovsky works there as well. I work somewhere completely different, and so on. Among us are scholars, businesspeople, and so forth. We have no foundation, no company. We live on the money we earn through our own hard work.
Each of you, as individuals, and your families live on that income?
We live on what we earn where we work. In other words, we have no income, special or otherwise, from this activity.
Ivan the Terrible is one of the most significant figures in Russian history. It's interesting what unbelievable things you're going to tell us about him. The first naive question, of course, is whether he killed his son, but that's not the main thing. The main question is, did Ivan the Terrible exist? What did he do? How did he rule? And was he truly terrible?
In one of our earlier broadcasts, we already mentioned the oddities of the era of Ivan the Terrible. For example, he was crowned Tsar 3 times. He married 7 times in violation of every conceivable church and secular canon, and he even put some Simeon Bekbalatovich on the throne to rule in his place, and everyone happily swore allegiance to him. Moreover, during his reign, Ivan the Terrible's policies shifted 180 degrees several times. As we've already said, in our view, Ivan the Terrible is actually a combination under a single name of 4 different tsars. Let me list them in order, as we understand it, and what happened during each period. The first tsar is the actual Ivan IV, Ivan Vasilievich. His reign was fairly prosperous for the state. This is the period when Kazan was taken. Apparently, Kazan was taken because a political religious uprising had broken out there. By the way, according to our reconstruction, Kazan and the Khazar Khaganate are in essence one and the same, two names for the same state, the Kazan Khanate. But Tsar Ivan IV Vasilievich fell gravely ill toward the end of his life, became a holy fool, and was buried as Vasily the Blessed. That is, a blessed holy fool Tsar. And the church was built in his honor. Meaning, the church was built not for some abstract blessed one but for the blessed Tsar himself. According to the chronicles, the blessed Tsar was buried with a huge assembly of people, as befits a Tsar's funeral. He was succeeded by his son Dmitri. We believe that the next Tsar was Dmitri, who died at a very young age in an accident. After him the throne was taken by his younger brother Ivan, Dmitri's brother. It was under the rule of Ivan Ivanovich, who was also a minor, that the Oprichnina began. The Oprichnina was initiated by the Zakharins to eradicate the old horde nobility. The minor Tsar Ivan was raised at the Zakharins' court. It's a long story, unfortunately impossible to retell briefly here. Incidentally, the Romanovs descend from the Zakharins. Their descendants later became the Romanov dynasty that came to power. It was the Zakharins who organized the Oprichnina. They destroyed the capital of the then empire, Yaroslavl, and transferred the capital to Moscow. Some believe that the construction of the Moscow Kremlin dates to this period. They were supported by a prince, a member of the ruling house named Georgy, who was later described in manuscripts as Yuri Dolgoruki. This, according to our reconstruction, is where Yuri Dolgoruki appears. And finally, the last, fourth Tsar is Tsar Simeon, who adopted the royal name Ivan. This happened in 1572. He came to power as a result of Moscow being taken by Tatar forces, that is, horde forces. The Zemshchina, that is, opponents of the Zakharins, organized a military campaign. Another civil war, Moscow is taken. After that begins the time of Maluda Skuratov, a reaction to the Zakharins' Oprichnina. The Oprichnina is wiped out.
It's not something you grasp all at once, is it?
Agreed.
Ivan the Terrible is, in fact, 4 different people. I'd like to wrap up the results of our interactive poll. People mostly want to talk about the past, some want to talk about the future, and the fewest want to talk about the present. With your permission, I'll reserve the right to repeat this question on a non-historical broadcast. It's clear why the past won today. What surprises me much more is that so many people want to talk about the future, and so few want to talk about the present. It seems people are simply too tired of the present. We have 3 minutes left. Briefly, what is your main impression from these 7 broadcasts?
I'd like to think that we now have many, if not supporters, then at least interested people who have begun to look more closely at some obvious facts. This is evident even from the questions, and from what friends and acquaintances tell me. The only thing we ask is, let's figure this out together.
Now, regarding how we'll figure this out together, you may know that the public has delegated historian Yuri Afanasyev to come on the show. A person for whom I have great respect. We even wanted to call him today, but he's currently on a work trip in Italy. I wasn't able to speak with him personally. I was told he will return in 3 days. If Yuri Nikolaevich agrees to come here, he is a supporter of the traditional historical view, and agrees to explain to us some of the logical inconsistencies and logical absurdities, then there will be a broadcast. This is not about methodology or anything like that. It's about logic. Why, during the so-called Tatar-Mongol yoke, were so many Orthodox churches being built? How exactly was the Tatar-Mongol army supplied with horseshoes, weapons, and everything else? If Yuri Nikolaevich agrees to such a conversation, we will invite him to take Andrei's seat, and we'll have that discussion. Once again, I have to say that I found it interesting, both the fact that such thoughts occur to people, and the fact that after these broadcasts, I realized that there are logical inconsistencies in traditional history. I just hadn't paid attention to them before, perhaps like many of you. And the fact that they exist, and that they need to be explained somehow, is probably the most important thing. With that, I, your host Andrei Maksimov, say goodbye to you, while our broadcast continues.